All right. So let's get into it. What is in the Climate Adaptation Plan? And so in the monthly presentations that we'll do for the rest of this year, we're going to get more in depth with the certain sections that are in this. And so for right now, I'm just going to give you a really quick overview of what's in the executive summary so that you know what's going to be coming and where you might go to look for more information about the specific things that you are interested in. And so come along with me for a ride. I'm going to first and foremost show you where you can find all of the wonderful documents that we have. And so right now, I'm hoping that you can see the CTUIR homepage. We're going to go to this top tab that says Governments and down to Departments. And from here, we will navigate down the page to find our Department of Natural Resources. And on our Department of Natural Resources page, over to the left, you will find climate adaptation towards the bottom. And so here is our dedicated climate adaptation website where you can find climate projections that have been done for our area. You can find the archived recordings of the webinar that we did in 2021. And here we have our finalized climate adaptation plan. And so if you scroll down, you can see that there are 3 options for you. We have the full plan is available in a lower resolution, which is going to be a little bit easier to download. There are a lot of photos and a lot of maps in here, and so it is a rather large document. And so the high resolution, if you're looking for a map that has specific information that you're looking for, you might want to try the high resolution version because it's going to be better grain on those maps that you're looking for. But for today, we're going to go through this executive summary, and I will try not to scroll too quickly to give anybody motion sickness, but I do want to stay within our time limit. And so the executive summary is offered separately from the full document. It didn't make a lot of sense to add the 40 pages of the executive summary then on top of what was already a very long plan. And so we separated them out into 2 different offerings. And in this executive plan or executive summary, you can see that chapters 1 and 2 are largely omitted. Chapter 1 is a lot of the background material of the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla people and the confederated governance that is operating now. And chapter 2 is more of that overarching climate science for the Pacific Northwest. It does have some information about ocean acidification, which is something that CTUIR does really care about, even though we are not a coastal tribe. Our salmon and our lamprey migrate out to the ocean to become nourished, and then they migrate back, bringing those resources and those nutrients back with them. And so in that way, we do care about ocean acidification and are keeping an eye on it. And so those are what's in chapter 1 and 2 that's missing from the executive summary. But the bulk of the information is in chapter 3, Shapatunwit, the impacts and adaptation goals. And so within this, our areas of focus are broken up with water, our surface and groundwaters, our first foods availability and access, our infrastructure and built systems, human health and happiness, energy production and use, economics and community, and then tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. And I wanted to just say thank you again to everyone who made our webinar series a success. It was amazing to see the knowledge that is contained within this community. Thank you for sharing with us. It is important to note that the Climate Adaptation Plan does not create a separate vision or mission. Some plans do, but this one does not. We felt that the comprehensive plan, the vision that was put forward in 2010 by the CTUIR community, was a great one to continue to work with. And so really what the Climate Adaptation Plan does is take that comprehensive plan vision out into an uncertain future. And so how to use this plan. When we talk about planning, a lot of the information that we use to make decisions is historical information, because obviously the future hasn't happened yet and we can't really look forward and say, oh, that's going to happen, so let's do this. But the problem with using historical data is that the future doesn't look like the past. And so if we are using historical data, we are planning for a future that doesn't exist. And so this climate adaptation plan is an opportunity to offer an alternative to our planning processes and say, this is what we think will happen. How does this affect now what we're planning to do? And especially for things like infrastructure that have such a long timeline, it really is important to make sure that we are planning for a more accurate future than historical data provides. The climate adaptation plan is also an opportunity to look more granularly at some of the projections offered by downscaled climate modeling. We've had a number of modeling efforts done for our area, and they give a really rough overview of things that are going to happen, like, oh, days over 90 degrees will increase, to this number. But that really doesn't tell us much about what that looks like on the ground for the work that we are doing and for the lives that we lead. And so this climate adaptation plan is an attempt to look at that on the ground information of what do these changes actually look like for our lives specifically. And a lot of the estimates that we need to make decisions are ones that we don't have directly. And so there are many proxy estimates in this plan that are used in lieu of the very specific data that we will need to generate. One of the best examples of this is the first foods, because they're not directly agricultural products or commercial products. There isn't a lot of attention paid to them in terms of data collection and modeling. And so some of the information that we're having to go on is information from an agricultural sector that is doing this modeling for their products. But this is also helping us identify where there are gaps in information that we will need to fill in as we go forward. And so this has been an exercise in seeing what information is and isn't there as well. The goals of the climate plan are really simple. One, center Indigenous knowledge and environmental justice in the climate crisis planning. We cannot keep making the same mistakes that have brought us to this point. And so when we look at adapting, we need to make sure that the people who have done the least to create this problem and have been adapting since time immemorial are the ones at the forefront, which is tribal people. Goal number 2 is the recognition that we cannot do this alone. We have to work together and create interdisciplinary strategies to address short-term variability from year to year and then long-term climatic changes. And then the third goal is to really celebrate the work that this tribe has done, not only since time immemorial, but in recent decades and recent years. This tribe and this community has been adapting. This tribe and this community is resilient. And so this is an opportunity to really put that into paper to become policy, so that as states and nations recognize climate adaptation work that's being done, this tribe is recognized as having always done this work. I'm sure the adaptation wheel is not new to a lot of you, but this is the kind of map that guides some of the work that we do. A lot of this can become really overwhelming, and it can be easy to get lost in all of the information that is coming out about climate modeling and the climate impacts that we're seeing. And so this adaptation wheel is a visual recognition that we are all connected. The work that we do is connected, and it provides a little bit of that Ariadne's thread through the labyrinth of climate modeling. And so it highlights the way that this plan is organized. And so again, we're going to go through these in detail throughout this year. And so I'm not going to dwell too much on each of these, but we'll start with water, the first of the first foods and the most important of everything. And so impacts to surface water, so the water flowing along the surface, will be things like changes in hydrology, impacts to the snowpack that we are able to accumulate throughout the year, as well as the droughts and the lower summer base flows that we expect to see. Groundwater was something that we really, really wanted to highlight as pulling out separate from surface water. They're really interconnected. So groundwater really informs surface water, and the surface water really impacts groundwater. But so much of the industries and the households on the Umatilla Indian Reservation are groundwater fed. And so knowing the changes to this particularly difficult to see resource is going to be really important. And so we see changes in storage capacity or storage potential, as well as a potential for contamination are something that we're looking at in this section. And then adaptations, conservation of water, number one. How are we, making sure that we have good, clean water in our rivers? Floodplain reconnection is another thing that we really focus on for our surface waters. And then data collection, working with partners on cross-jurisdictional monitoring of waters, and then the management of water is something that we really highlight here in these adaptations. For first foods, we have first foods availability. So that's the health and the abundance of the first foods themselves out on the lands. Warming waters, we know are an impact for salmon and other aquatic species. We know that plants are changing their migration patterns, their timing out on the lands. And we know that they have really important connections with insects like pollinators. And so how are these relationships changing as a result of increasing carbon dioxide? And then how are other species migrating? So our invasive and displaced species pressures, how are these being affected by increasing carbon? We also see topsoil and riparian erosion. As the water is moving faster, it's more likely to take our important soil to a place that we are not able to utilize it. And then that soil is also not supporting the plants that keep bigger species like deer and elk sustained. And we see calf nutrition being something that really is going to be impacted, as well as the changing potential for plant and animal pathogens. So those are things like ticks and bacteria and mold. These are things that will thrive under warming conditions. And so how do we get ahead of that? First foods access are the ways that tribal members are able to get to harvest opportunities. And so we see impacts like flooding and storms take out bridges and roads that are essential to access certain points of the forest or harvest opportunities. Wildfire risk puts everyone at risk, or it threatens public safety as well as access points. And then poor air quality, access issues can be intangible like heat and smoke. And so looking at what do we do when the air or the temperature is hazardous for us to be out exercising our treaty rights. And so these adaptations really look at, again, that getting information, where are information gaps and where can we be doing better for knowing what's happening. Also proactively managing wildfire risk by doing fuels treatment, and then understanding our harvest opportunities and practices and how first foods either respond or negatively or positively to these, and how do we use that information to inform how we go about harvest now and into the future. Physical infrastructure are like our roads, our bridges, and our buildings. These are all things that we put a lot of money into, and so we would like them to continue to persist. Increasing severity and frequency of storms, not only flooding and wind events, but also things like heat, will really stress our buildings and our built infrastructure. Transportation infrastructure is the one that first comes to mind, I think, for a lot of people, especially Forest Service roads that are used to access harvest opportunities. And so knowing how these points of access are going to be impacted is really important. Indoor air filtration is already starting to become, really impacted, as we see smoky summers as just one of many air quality pollutants. Our HVAC systems are really going to struggle to keep up with all of that. And then development in the wildland urban interface, while not specifically a climate impact, knowing how our footprint out on the land, whether we're encroaching into the forest or down to the river, restricts our ability to manage those natural systems in a changing climate. Built systems are our communication networks, our transportation networks. And so looking at our impacts to how we communicate, how our kayak public transit service might be impacted by climate change will give us a fuller picture, as well as the increased potential for water and airborne pathogens as a result of our built infrastructure, things like our water pipes, is something that I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about when they think about climate impacts, but is something to keep an eye on. And then it's not all bad news. We also see opportunities to mitigate carbon release through materials management. And so recycling and composting are two things that we see really highlighted here as opportunities for this. And so the adaptations are, again, just trying to know more, of getting people involved in information and reporting, of developing communities that are walkable or, transportable over non-carbonized sources. And so walking, biking, horses, building communities where everything is right there so that you're not having to use carbon, burn carbon to live your day-to-day life. And then there's always opportunities to divert materials from landfills to prevent carbon from methane and other decomposition emissions. And so physical health, this health is both physical and emotional, right? And so complications from extreme heat will be something that our area will really need to grapple with, especially people who find themselves outside for a large part of their year. That also goes true for wildfire smoke. Smoke is actually something that really, over a long period of time, chronic exposure causes a lot of problems. And so how do we prepare people for those chronic exposure conditions? Contamination of water from harmful algal blooms on the lands are something that we need to get more of a handle on. We've seen that happen in the Richland area the last couple of years. And so knowing more about how our algal blooms are going to affect ability to exercise treaty rights in those areas is important. Allergy season is something that a lot of people have talked about when we're doing outreach. And so unfortunately, allergies will become more potent as we go forward into a warming climate. And then ozone is something that I think is really unique for us in the Pacific Northwest region because of industries located along the Columbia River. We're actually more likely to see impacts from ozone for our tribal fishermen more specifically than for the rest of the Pacific Northwest. Emotional well-being, so connection to first foods and spiritual connection to culture. As species migrate and as things become more challenging, there is a potential for a disconnection from Indigenous culture. And so making sure that we're really getting ahead of that and making sure that people have those connections and those opportunities to learn is really essential. And then making sure that we are aware that Indigenous communities, the connection to the land and to the community itself is so much more important than for non-Indigenous communities. And so making sure that we're really highlighting the fact that displacement has a disproportionate burden on Indigenous people. So shelter in place orders are not always the answer. Displacement needs to really be addressed proactively. This is a place where we examine those impacts. And so adaptations are a lot of just coming together of opportunities like this and the ones that we'll have later this year of coming together and sharing our experiences and our stories with one another is really a huge component of being healthy and happy in a climate future. Energy is generated and used. And so we look at the energy generation and transmission here. The way that energy is generated is likely to change because of changing climate conditions. But then we also need to keep our eye on transmission because that is really where there's a potential for a lot of things to go wrong, especially as energy facilities are looking to pass increasing costs off to customers. And then we know that as summers get warmer, we here are already fairly prepared for extreme heat, but our west side, like the Portland area, really is still coming to terms with that. And so we will see this dramatic increase demand for summer cooling as this life-saving strategy, which is also likely to cause energy prices to increase for everyone. But the good news is there is an opportunity for energy efficiency to reduce our demand on the energy grid, and for us to be able to be more insulated from some of these climate effects. And so the adaptations that are offered here for energy are a lot of what we're already doing, which is look at renewable energy potential where it's appropriate, of making sure tribal families and entrepreneurs have information, technical assistance, and financial assistance to implement energy projects that they want to implement, and to make sure that we are all moving forward together. So economics and community, this is really how people interact with each other. And so looking at economic development, disasters are very expensive. And so when we talk about increasing disasters, we are looking at the fact that, you know, governments are having to respond to flooding events, and families are having to fork out money for displacement for a period of time. And so this all has a dollar value. And so trying to look at how is responding to natural disasters going to increase financial burdens on families and governments. Tourism is a big part of our economy, and so we don't really have a good idea of how a lot of these disasters are going to impact the way people travel and spend money. And then disruption of supply chains is something that we really, the last couple of years, have seen come full force. That when things happen around the globe, we are impacted because we are buying from global businesses. And this is unfortunately likely to continue into the future. We will also see municipalities and nations grapple with the costs of climate change. More than half of the counties in the United States are going to be spending more money responding to climate emergencies than they are taking in annual revenue. And so that's not a good math equation to find yourself in. And so unfortunately, we are in one of those areas. And so how do we get ahead of this hemorrhaging of money responding to climate crisis impacts before they arrive? But there's also opportunities for carbon sequestration through vegetation and soil management. And so if you're looking for farming and forestry impacts, this is going to be right here in this economic development component. There's a lot that looks at how do we sequester carbon, not only for the benefit of pulling it out of the air, but for the benefit of the soil and the plants that we are managing as well. Community support, how do we continue to connect with one another? And so with shelter in place orders that come with like heat and smoke, that makes isolation a very real danger, especially for people who have mobility challenges, or for elders who really don't have a lot to do other than be outside. And so how do we make sure that people are not being left behind, left in isolation when we are responding to these disasters? And this goes too for the emotional and mental strain. It can be a lot to deal with some of these things, especially if they're coming one after another. And so building resilience within ourselves and our communities is really important. Population migration is another thing that we really don't have a lot of good information about yet. And so this is an opportunity for us to learn more about our neighbors and how migration might affect our area. And then changes in food security and food safety. We've already seen that as things change, the way that we can supply food safely to our community is going to change as well. So adaptations for this section are all about getting people the tools that they need. It's a lot of supporting small businesses. It's a lot of teaching people food safe practices. It's a lot of making sure that people have the ability to get food assistance if they find themselves in need. And then as well as bringing the land back to the tribe. So developing a land acquisition plan and different ways of implementing land back is a part of this section. And then the last one, tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. How does the government continue to manage itself and its community in a self-determining way into the future? We know that resources are likely to become strained. And so making sure that we're proactively managing conflict is going to be a big part of this. Conflict not only just over resources, but also with our communities as well, as we see increasing extreme heat cause people to behave in stranger ways. And then we also know that the collective continuance, the promise of the first foods, is something that will be strained by climate change, but we can get ahead of that. And knowing that, what do we do to manage for that strain? And then there really is an opportunity for tribes, especially federally recognized tribes, to be leaders in this work. Not only have tribes been adapting to changes in climate since time immemorial, but federally recognized tribes have a really interesting suite of mechanisms at their disposal to force action that other stakeholders don't have. And so really we see an opportunity for tribes to be at the forefront of this work. For treaty rights, it's a little bit of a repeat of what we've already said. There is really an opportunity to reduce risk through cultural practices, through making sure people are continuing to do what they have done for centuries, especially with cultural burning here on the West Side. We really see a benefit to bringing that practice back. And then making sure that people are out on the lands safely, especially when there are heat and smoke conditions, as well as a bunch of other challenges to safety during treaty rights exercise. And so adaptation goals for this are really work with our partners. Again, we cannot do this work alone. A lot of the first foods are found off of the res, and so we need to be working with partners who have the tribe's interests in heart, because what's good for the tribe is good for the region, as Anton Minthorn always says. And so working with our partners and pulling at those mechanisms, the legal and legislative mechanisms that this tribe has specifically, as well as working with education and communication. I'm really glad that our language program had the participation that they did with our webinar series, because like keeping the language alive is like a huge part of keeping the culture alive. And so making sure that we really are protecting that is a huge part of climate adaptation. And so I think that that might be where I will cut it for now. Like I said, we are going to go through these in depth. And so I'm looking forward to what the future holds with everyone. So thank you again. I'll talk with you soon.